It didn't begin with blood or sirens, but with a coat, a shade of blue seen once in the Oxford rain, and never again. Hours later, a student vanished from a locked room. No escape, no trace. Just silence. Before we begin, where are you listening from tonight? It began, as these things tend to, not with blood or sirens, but with a coat, a particular shade of blue. Not navy, not cobalt, but something in between, like sky just after rain. I'd been watching the drizzle slip down the windows of the Randolph Lounge, which at that hour offered the warmth of indifferent coffee and the slow folding of newspapers by men with nowhere else to be. The coat appeared beyond the glass, a flicker of color against the grey stone of Beaumont Street, and then turned the corner toward All Souls. The figure moved lightly, head bowed. Not fast enough to be late, not slow enough to be lost, simply disappearing, as some women do. I didn't think of it again until hours later, when the letter arrived, typed, unsigned, and folded with the sort of precision that suggests fear rather than formality. Lewis read it aloud while standing awkwardly by the coat stand, as if even the words might stain the upholstery. A postgraduate student, Isla Merrin, had vanished from Queen's College. Vanished, not walked out, not run away, not failed to appear. The room was bolted from the inside, it said. No broken glass, no signs of forced entry, and no one had seen her leave. I nodded slowly and gestured for Lewis to pass the letter over. He did so with the reluctance of someone who still believes that missing people eventually turn up at bus stations or seaside B&Bs, blinking into the daylight and apologizing for the fuss. But the note felt different in my hand. There was something deliberate in its restraint. No accusations, no plea, just the fact of absence, set in courier type. I walked to the window and looked out, as if she might still be there, drifting along the perimeter of my vision. But only tourists now, and umbrellas blooming like weary flowers. Queens was quiet when we arrived. Rain tends to mute even the most arrogant architecture, and the porter, a greying man with eyes like extinguished lamps, seemed grateful for the company, even if he pretended otherwise. He led us through the cloisters to the lodging staircase. Second floor, south wing. She kept to herself, he said, which is how these things usually begin. The room was small, orderly, and entirely untouched, not in the forensic sense. That word has never meant much to me, but emotionally untouched. Her suitcase stood neatly beside the armoire. One window barred with ornamental iron lattice. The bed was made, the desk clear, but for a single sheet of paper. A half-finished crossword, the ink faded but assertive. 17 across. Invisible Refuge, 5. Lewis noted the books. Mostly poetry. Some criticism. A worn volume of Emily Dickinson with dog-eared pages and a scent of old, paper and faint lavender. He picked it up, then placed it down again, as if afraid it might bruise. There was no note, no torn photograph, no coffee cup gone cold or curtains drawn with urgency, and yet the room breathed with something unspoken, like the moment before a bell is rung. I asked the porter whether anyone had seen her leave. He shrugged. "There's a side door," he said, "used by the delivery men, but it locks from the outside. She'd need someone to let her out." Or in, I thought. But I didn't say it aloud. We returned to the CID by way of Merton Street. The rain had turned to mist, and Oxford wore its dampness like an old habit. Lewis drove in silence, fiddling with the radio until I told him not to. I kept thinking of the coat, how it had moved just beyond my attention, how it had disappeared not with drama, but with a kind of practiced grace. That night I poured a glass of Glenlivet and stared at the crossword. 5 letters, invisible refuge. The mind leaps to haven, but it could just as easily be crypt, or niche, or perhaps something less literal. A metaphor, a line from a poem. I found myself murmuring Dickinson under my breath. Her line about a soul admitted to itself. I imagined Isla Merrin in that blue coat, standing in the doorway of her room, listening for something. Or someone. Vanished from a bolted room. No signs of departure, no witnesses, no sound. Except, perhaps, the soft rustle of a coat brushing against rain-soaked stone. And something, I couldn't quite say what, began to whisper that this wasn't just a disappearance, it was a performance, and someone had written it well. Queen's College never tried to be beautiful, not in the way Magdalen preens or Christ Church sprawls in its imperial self-regard. No. Queen's is austere, inward-facing, a geometry of discipline and silence, the kind of place where minds sharpen quietly and solitude passes as virtue. Even the porter seemed surprised by our arrival, as though no one was ever supposed to knock on certain doors. The lodging house stood at the edge of the quad's older wing, a building half forgotten by time and entirely forgotten by the undergraduates who preferred newer brick and modern plumbing. The staircase smelled of varnish, and somewhere beneath it a pipe throbbed with the low moan of winter's hesitation. We climbed without speaking. The rain, which had accompanied us since morning, continued to fall in the sort of whisper that makes you doubt it's there at all. Second floor, third door. The key turned too easily. I stepped inside, and the stillness met me like a held breath. The room was not large, nor particularly furnished. Just a narrow iron-framed bed, a plain writing desk with a brass lamp, and shelves that had surrendered their spine to poetry and criticism alike. A single window, tall but barred, looked out onto the chapel's slate roof. The curtains had been drawn halfway, as if unsure whether day had earned entry. Her suitcase sat against the armoire, still latched, the leather cracked at the corners but clean. On the desk, a mug with the ghost of tea stains, and beside it, the crossword. Same clue I'd seen before. Invisible refuge. 5. Blank still. Waiting, perhaps, for a mind that no longer returned to it. Lewis ran a careful eye along the skirting boards, saying something about the lack of scuff marks or fingerprints, though his tone betrayed little belief in such comforts. I let him do his catalogue. My eyes had settled on the bookshelf. The arrangement was peculiar. Alphabetical, yes, but with an intensity of order that felt more monastic than practical. Eliot nestled beside Dickinson, then Frost, then Hardy. I ran a finger down the spines, stopping at Yeats, or rather, where Yeats should have been. I crouched, beneath the bed, in the narrow strip between floorboards and dust, something dark and slim pressed against the wall. I drew it out, a leather-bound volume, The Wind Among the Reeds. The pages were curled at the edges, the leather damp. Rainwater, but how? The window was shut, and if it had fallen recently, why hadn't she picked it up? Lewis glanced over. Found something? Not sure yet, I said. We waited in the common room of the English faculty for Dr. Adrian Venn, who arrived 10 minutes later, smelling faintly of bergamot and something more expensive. He greeted us with the cultivated hesitation of a man who's taught too long to be certain when he's being questioned. Isla Merrin, he began, was one of our more incandescent minds. There was something insufferably careful in the way he chose the word. Incandescent, as though describing not warmth, but danger, a brilliance that might burn. She was pursuing a DPhil on absence and embodiment in Victorian elegy, he added, smiling at the ceiling as though the phrase amused him more than it ought to. I asked when he'd last seen her. 3 days ago, he said. They'd had coffee. She was distracted. Brilliant, but distant. That wasn't unusual. She mention anyone she was worried about? He shook his head too quickly. Anyone she was close to? Again, the same gesture. Isla was a private person, he said, often lost in her own texts. We rose to leave, and I paused. "One more thing," I said. "Did Isla ever mention Yates?" Ven smiled again, this time with less warmth. She mentioned everyone. That was her trouble. As we stepped back into the rain, Lewis pulled up his collar and muttered that he didn't like the man. Too smooth. I didn't disagree. But something else stayed with me. Something in the way Ven had said lost in her own texts, as if loss were a habit rather than an event. Back at my flat, I dried the Yates volume gently on a towel, page by page. Most were unremarkable. But midway through, I found a pencil line, faint as though quickly erased, under the stanza. "I would spread the cloths under your feet." And beside it, in the margin, a note. Not a gift. Disguised, the room had not been ransacked. No one had stormed out. No one had come in. And yet, something had shifted. The absence had weight. I returned to the crossword. 5 letters, invisible refuge. I wrote haven, then hesitated, and erased it. Too obvious. Then, softly, I wrote alibi, and stared at it for a long time. There are places in Oxford where time does not pass. It collects. The Bodleian is one of them. Its air tastes faintly of dust and scholarship, and its silence is never entirely silent. Pages breathe. Footsteps echo back decades. I've always liked it here, though I come less for the knowledge than for the forgetting, mine and others. It was early still. Rain pressed against the windows, soft as apology. The librarian knew me by name or by reputation, which is much the same thing in Oxford. She pointed me toward the special collections register without ceremony, and I took a seat by the long oak desk, its surface rubbed smooth by generations of elbows, ink stains, and private discoveries. The reading log was unremarkable at first. Students seeking Byron letters, a visiting scholar inquiring after Anglo-Saxon charms. Then, Ila's name, written in the same looping hand as the college registry, I. Merrin. Date 2 weeks prior. Request microfilm correspondence, H.D. Lawrence collection, box 17, No Light for the Dreaming. I paused. The poetess was unfamiliar to me. A minor Victorian, I presumed. The title rang faintly with the sort of self-erasure common to women writers of that era, where even illumination was framed as deprivation. The log offered a cross-reference, housed under a supplementary drawer. Poets Lesser Known, Volume 2, M to Z. The librarian unlocked the drawer without comment. The fiche arrived in a dull grey box with fraying corners. I loaded it myself. There is something oddly sacred about watching words appear through a magnified lens. Spectral, smudged, but insistent. The letters were brittle with time, fragments of a correspondence between the poetess, who signed only L, and a man identified as a Thornley. There were references to confinement, to silence, to a manuscript destroyed by a housekeeper. One line stood out, more vivid than the rest. I have made myself vanish. That is the only power they did not anticipate. I sat back. The screen flickered slightly. It was hard to tell whether Isla had been reading the words as a scholar or as something else entirely. A woman leaning toward an old echo, trying to divine her own exit through someone else's erasure. A whisper of movement passed behind me. A coat rustling. Then gone. The library, in its peculiar way, observes without presence. On impulse, I rang the number listed beside the final citation, a paper delivered 10 years ago at a conference now defunct. The voice that answered was female, crisp but cautious. I introduced myself. Inspector Morse, Thames Valley, CID. A pause. Then, quietly, I was expecting you, eventually. Madeline Huntley. Her name had not surfaced in years. Once a promising academic, then abruptly gone, a leave of absence that became a quiet retirement. I asked if I might speak with her. She hesitated. I don't discuss former students. Isla's missing, I said. Another pause. Then, come in person. I won't say a word on the phone. The line went dead with a finality that felt rehearsed. I stood. The fiche was still turning softly, like a carousel. On my way out, I passed the reception log. I don't usually look at such things, but something halted me. Not a hunch, just a thinning in the atmosphere, a slight tear in the ordinary. The name was there again. I, Merrin. Logged in 3 days after her supposed disappearance. Not her handwriting. Subtly wrong. The loop on the R was clipped. The M leaned too far forward as if trying to walk ahead of itself. The entry had no signature out. Either she never left, or someone wanted it to seem that way. I stood in the doorway a moment too long, letting the damp air press against my collar. Lewis would have called it nothing. A clerical error, a coincidence, but Oxford doesn't do coincidences. It buries them. Under footnotes, beneath corrections in pencil, behind initials that mean more than names. I walked back to the station alone. The wind had changed direction, and the scent of coal smoke had returned to the streets. That old, half-forgotten breath of winter. The woman who vanished might not have vanished at all. She might have simply stepped into someone else's signature, and someone, somewhere, had handed her the pen. The taxi coughed twice before fading into the mist behind me. I stood outside a narrow cottage just past Jericho, where Oxford gives up trying to impress and simply remembers how to endure. The gate had no latch. The ivy looked tired. The bell was broken, so I knocked gently, the way one might knock on the past. She answered without a word. Madeline Huntley. Thinner than her voice, and older than the stories that still circled her name like stubborn footnotes. She waved me inside with a hand that once must have marked hundreds of student essays, with marginalia that stung more than grades. The living room smelled faintly of gardenia, and something fainter still. Perhaps dust from 1,000 pages never returned to the Bodleian. She poured tea but didn't offer it, and I didn't ask. She spoke Isla's name as if it had once been hers, not in ownership, but in reflection. Said she was brilliant, which I expected, and then said something else, too easily seduced by literary ghosts. I let that hang in the space between us, the way you let a poem finish echoing before you turn the page. She gestured toward the bookcase, not quite an invitation. I saw old editions of Levy's Wolfe, 2 volumes of Sappho's fragments in different translations, the sort of shelf that could both soothe and eviscerate. She caught me looking and said, sharply, that the girl wanted to believe vanishing was a form of authorship. I asked what she meant. She traced the rim of her teacup with a single finger and said, the poetess, the one from No Light for the Dreaming, hadn't died in childbirth, not really. Officially, yes, elegantly. But the records were thin, and Madeline always suspected it had been an escape. Reputation in tatters. A lover too ambitious. Easier to die in verse than live in shame. She thought Isla saw that. Saw disappearance as a literary device. And what was she running from? I asked. The girl. She shrugged. Perhaps from being seen too clearly, or not enough. Some women oscillate between those until they simply unhook. I changed tack. Asked about Adrian Venn. The porcelain stopped moving. She said nothing for a long moment, then exhaled through her nose as if some private promise had been broken. He likes his women unreadable. It wasn't spoken cruelly. Just quietly, the way a scholar might summarize a failed essay. All form, no center. I asked if she thought Isla feared him. No, she said. Not feared. But Isla never understood the difference between being studied and being watched. It was nearly time to leave. The walls had grown closer. Books leaned like listeners. Before I could thank her, She stood and disappeared down a hallway. Returned with a faded folder, the kind academics use when they haven't quite let go of something. She handed it to me with reluctance, but no ceremony. Isla had posted it to her, unsolicited. Months ago. Said it had been nagging her, that there was a truth not footnoted properly. Inside, a torn diary page, yellowed but intact. The handwriting slanted left, compressed, nervous. A line had been underlined twice. She built her silence like a stair, below it an asterisk, no footnote, and a photograph. 4 students in an unlabeled courtyard, probably from a summer term. One of them was Ven, hair longer then, but the same unplaceable smile. Another man I didn't recognize. Angular, too tall for the frame. A third with his face turned half away, and the woman beside Ven, unnamed, her eyes too large for her age, her posture not quite trusting the lens. Madeline said she didn't know the names, or claimed not to. The page had no annotation, the photo, no date. I stood at the threshold, folder in hand, and she said one last thing, though not to me, not directly. "Disappearance isn't the same as absence," she murmured. Some people vanished to be found differently. The wind had risen slightly by the time I reached the main road. Leaves pressed themselves against the pavement like letters not sent. In the photograph, Ven's hand rested just behind the woman's shoulder. Not touching, just almost, as if he already knew she'd slip away. It had been a Thursday, though I remember it more by the weather than the week. Damp, reluctant, the kind of cold that doesn't sharpen but softens, slowly, until even the stone seems tired of its own endurance. Lewis met me outside the quad, his breath rising in pale swirls. He had that look he gets when facts don't fit, but still insist on being true. He said the porter had nothing new. But the cellar log told a different story, a bottle of Chablis, signed out under Isla's name the night she vanished. 2 glasses requested. No return noted. She didn't drink white, I said. Lewis blinked. You knew that? I didn't answer, but I'd seen the corner of her shelf. Reds, mostly. A single, unopened Muscat. Academic women in literature departments don't drink Chablis alone. Ven admitted they'd argued that night. Nothing dramatic, he said. Just a disagreement about research boundaries. She'd grown obsessed. He used the word like a surgeon describing a manageable tumor. Said he left at 10. The phrasing was polished, rehearsed, with the kind of certainty one rarely brings to memory, unless it's been rehearsed in the mirror. I asked what she said to make him angry. He smiled faintly. Isla could be difficult, that word again. Difficult, as if brilliance were a flaw to be endured, rather than understood. The night watchman remembered someone descending the back stairwell just before midnight. He hadn't paid attention at the time, but the scarf stayed with him. Dark blue, with the Queen's College crest, the kind tutors are given after a decade of patient disdain. Ven's scarf, or one like it. I let the silence stretch, then asked if he'd retrieved the bottle. Ven blinked. What bottle? That was enough. Not proof, not yet. But something had slipped. A man who remembers an argument with precision forgets the wine that followed it. Back at the station, a second letter awaited me. This one handwritten, though carefully, with the kind of exaggerated neatness found in old schoolrooms and confessions. No signature. No date, it quoted Blake. He who binds to himself a joy does the winged life destroy. The ink bled slightly at the edges, as if the pen had hesitated. The paper smelled faintly of orange peels, a sharp domestic scent that seemed at odds with the words. Lewis frowned at it, then passed it back like something mildly contagious. He said it was just more theater. But I felt differently. The scent of citrus. It was familiar. Not from Isla's room, nor Madeline's cottage. From somewhere quieter. And the phrasing, joy, winged life, It reminded me of something musical, though I couldn't place it. A cantata, perhaps. Bach, if I had to guess. Something choral and unfinished. The letter wasn't a threat. It was a regret. That night I sat alone and tried to finish the crossword again. Invisible refuge. 5. I wrote niche, then changed it to crypt, then erased both. The clue wasn't meant to be solved. It was meant to be heard. I thought of the cellar, the stairwell, the scarf, but mostly I thought of Isla. Not as a missing person, as a reader, a writer, a woman who saw meaning where others saw method, a woman who might vanish, not from fear, but from a desire to control the narrative. And I thought of Venn, descending the back stair at midnight with a bottle he didn't mention, wrapped in a scarf he would later deny. Some lies are louder in silence, and sometimes a scent, citrus, light, absurd, lingers longer than fingerprints. I folded the letter, slid it into the case file, and poured myself a measure of whiskey. Not for clarity, for quiet. The music would come later, and with it, perhaps, the name I hadn't yet remembered. The music began without ceremony, as though it had always been playing somewhere just beneath the surface of things. A modest ensemble, nothing elaborate. Strings, organ, a soprano whose voice seemed to lean rather than rise. Bach, of course. Cantata BWV 131, I think. Or perhaps it only resembled one. They blur, those pieces, not through sameness but through sorrow. I'd gone alone. Lewis had declined politely, and I hadn't pressed. The hall was half full, mostly faculty, a few retired dons who still dressed for the ritual. The man beside me smelt of tobacco leaf and wet wool. I smelt nothing. I was already elsewhere. Euler had written an essay once. I'd read it late. On a Sunday I remember only for its fog. Absence and harmony in unfinished movements. A strange, sprawling piece, more reflection than argument. She had traced the silence within certain compositions. Women composers, mostly. Noting how they would disappear not from failure, but by design. She wrote, "A woman's unfinished work is rarely incomplete. It is often a concealment, a hidden gesture, a refusal to resolve." I found the paper again that night, the copy Madeline had given me. A photocopy, corner torn, penciled notes in the margin not Isla's. Her voice was in it. Not just her argument, her desire to vanish cleanly, without disorder. She admired composers who had ended things mid-phrase, not tragically, quietly. I went to the music department the next morning. The building faces away from the road, as if embarrassed by its own acoustics. The corridor smelled of varnished benches and brass polish. Students passed by with expressionless cases, their shoes too clean. The registrar remembered Isla. Pale girl, always reading scores that weren't on the syllabus. She had copied a collection of fragments, mostly keyboard pieces. 2 weeks ago, just before she stopped attending seminars. Had she been with anyone? I asked. Number. But she'd inquired about practice rooms, specifically soundproofed ones. That struck me. The question wasn't where she had gone, but why she'd needed to disappear unheard. Down the hall, I passed an old piano room, door ajar. A student played the same 4 bars again and again. It made no progress, only the shape of intention, the ache of unfinished things. Later at home, I reread her essay. A paragraph stood out. Women who vanish are not always fleeing. Sometimes they are composing, something unlistenable to others, but deeply clear to themselves. I underlined it, then returned to the coat. It had been left where it would be noticed, but not questioned. Blue, striking, entirely unlike the person described to us. Discreet, spare, inward. The coat was a signal, a flourish in an otherwise silent phrase. She wanted it seen, which meant she wanted someone to know she had disappeared, and that it wasn't done to her. Lewis would have dismissed it as self-indulgence, but he reads people like maps, expecting the lines to match the land. I read her like I read the cantata. The piece at the recital had ended unresolved, with a trailing phrase in the lower strings. The soprano didn't bow. She simply lowered her head, and the conductor nodded to no one in particular. In that moment, something shifted. Disappearance, yes, but composed, placed like a cadence deferred, and the question that remained, the one that kept me from sleep, was simple and unsolvable. If Isla Merrin had vanished on purpose, why leave the final bars unfinished? Why the coat? Why the guest book signature in a different hand? Why the crossword left blank? As I closed her essay, I saw the pencil note in the corner, not her handwriting. See also, false resolution, Picardy 3rd. I stared at it for a long time. The sudden, unexpected major chord at the end of a minor work. A trick of brightness, a disguise, something cheerful where sorrow belonged. She had been studying how to disappear, but someone, I feared, had learned from her too well and copied the ending. Badly. Lewis was sure of it. Venn was lying. Not just evasive, not just couched in the usual university flourishes of plausible ambiguity. Lying. His certainty made him restless. He paced more, sat forward too early in chairs, frowned even when no one was watching. He'd found something. A clipped article buried in a personnel review from 5 years prior. A student, female, early 20s, much the same as Isla, had been moved quietly to another college. Officially, a transfer due to academic incompatibility. Unofficially, a complaint that never quite became formal. The girl had withdrawn her claim before it could be investigated. The report had been redacted, though not well. Venn's name appeared twice in the margins, faint but unmistakable. Lewis laid the paper on my desk as though it might bleed. He knew something then, Lewis said. He knows something now. I nodded, then waited. He wants it to be him, I thought. Wants the suspect to be legible, containable. But the best liars don't contradict themselves. They misplace emphasis. Venn hadn't contradicted a thing. He had simply chosen which sentences to ornament. We brought him in again. No formality. Just a quiet room and an even quieter cup of tea cooling between us. I asked him about the student. Her name meant nothing to him, he said. Then something shifted. He tapped the spoon once against the rim, an affectation, a deflection. Eventually, he said the student had become dependent. His voice flattened on the word as though dependence were a weakness to be cured. She had misinterpreted professional concern, a tragic misunderstanding. And Isla? I asked. He met my gaze then, his own unreadable. Isla was solitary, he said. Moved through the world like a woman in rehearsal for something deeper. She didn't need anyone, least of all me. Lewis wanted to press him further, but I signaled no. There are silences you interrogate. Others you let hang until the dust begins to settle into shape. We returned to Queen's that afternoon. The light had shifted. Warmer now, but uncertain. The kind of light that shows things not because it wants to, but because it has grown tired of hiding. Something about the room still troubled me. The symmetry. The way nothing was truly out of place, and yet nothing truly belonged. I moved to the corner, beneath the desk, and knelt. Lewis, to his credit, said nothing. I tapped the floor once, then twice. Hollow, not dramatically so, just enough to register as wrong. A panel slightly lifted at one edge. Paint chipped, dust recently disturbed. I pried it gently. Beneath, a shallow cavity. A rusted latch, long disused but not rusted shut. A tunnel. We traced it with torches borrowed from the porter's office. narrow, damp, clinging to the old stone like a wound that refused to heal. It wound eastward, then veered beneath a stairwell, then ended, abruptly, no exit, no signs of use, no footprints, but something lingered, a scent, not decay, not mold, lilies, artificial, the kind sprayed in cheap rooms to feign elegance. Beneath that, ink, the dry metallic tang of it. Lewis said nothing, but I saw the shift in his posture. Something had fractured the shape of his certainty. Back at the station, I opened the diary page Madeline had given me. I hadn't read it closely enough the first time. She built her escape in silence. The line wasn't metaphor. The tunnel wasn't escape. It was staging, a rehearsal of disappearance, a quote made physical. The question wasn't how she had left. It was whether she had ever intended to leave at all. I didn't sleep that night, not fully. The air was too still. Even the crossword refused to cooperate. 2 theories, neither right. Lewis chasing a predator. Myself chasing a ghost. And perhaps, just perhaps, Ela Merrin had become both. The box had been misfiled, though I no longer believe in such accidents. Dust had claimed it as its own, nestled behind an archive shelf in the English faculty's basement, where dead theses go to rest and grow silent. Lewis found it while combing Isla's academic trail, a kindness he disguised as diligence. Just tapes, he'd said, old dictaphone cassettes, poorly labeled, spine curling from damp. He handed them to me as if expecting nothing. I took them as if I did. It was late by the time I played the first. Rain tapped against the ear glass in a rhythmic politesse. The whiskey had dulled but not softened the ache behind my temples. I sat with the lamp low, its glow just enough for company. The first tape hissed. Room tone, pages turning. A sigh. Isla's voice emerged slowly, as though summoned reluctantly. Not a lecture voice, not the crisp diction of someone speaking to be understood, but intimate, private. She read from a letter, or perhaps a diary. The words not hers, but claimed as hers for a moment. Where rooms had no window, I carved a door of verse. She paused after that line, a breath caught, then held. Something inside it, fear, maybe, or the realization of prophecy. The voice continued, her own now, calm but not steady. The tunnel exists. I've been down twice. There's no lock on the second door. It's been bricked, but the mortar's thin. There's a space behind it, and something else. A ledger, or what's left of one. The name's smudged, but the initial is L. There was a shift then. The ambient static flattened. The air changed. A faint creak. Footsteps. Then another voice, closer to the mic than it should have been. Low, male. Not angry, but coaxing. The kind of voice used to dissuade rather than threaten. We can't open that, Isla. You know what that would do. Then her voice again, tight now. You knew she didn't die. You knew. A silence followed that felt like standing on the wrong side of a locked door. Then, the tape cut. The player clicked as though exhaling. I sat still for a long time. My hand reached for the rewind, but stopped short. You don't rewind prophecy. You let it linger. Lewis, when I told him, leaned forward like a man squinting through smoke. He was certain. Then, he said. That was his voice. No doubt I wasn't so sure. It was familiar, yes, but too familiar. Something about its cadence echoed differently, a tone more precise, clipped at the ends. It reminded me of the third figure in the photograph Madeline had given me, the one with his face half turned, as if he knew the camera would remember him better that way. I went back to the photo. 4 figures. Then, the woman, still unnamed, the tall boy with nervous posture, and the 4th, anonymous until now, a bursar's assistant, hired last year under a different surname. I'd seen him once in passing, never spoke, but the voice matched the photograph. I requested the personnel file. Carefully, quietly. A name change in 2004, a 5-year gap in employment history. Enough to let something go cold. He, too, had been in love with someone who disappeared, and Isla, it seemed, had uncovered the pattern. I returned to the tape, played it again, softer. This time it was the silence that struck me, the kind that happens between people who know they are being overheard, which meant the tape wasn't accidental. It was placed, left where it might be found, but not too soon. A breadcrumb disguised as a record. What unsettled me most wasn't the voice. It was the absence of one. After the cut, no sound, no struggle. Just nothing. As though she'd stepped into the metaphor too fully. Carved a door of verse and walked through, or been pulled back by a man who had once loved a vanished woman and couldn't bear a second disappearance. I turned the lamp lower and sat back. Some endings don't require violence. Just quiet hands and enough space to close a door, or brick it. From the inside, the record's annex was colder than I expected. Not in temperature, precisely. The radiators hummed with institutional obedience. But in atmosphere. It was the sort of place that had forgotten it once belonged to a college. Files lived here now, not thought. We had come on a rumor. One of the older clerks, softened by the scent of Lewis's politeness, had mentioned that the east wing of the archives sat atop older stone. Something pre-war, possibly pre-Victorian. Rooms built not for scholarship, but for storage or secrecy. We found the seam by accident, a shelving unit that didn't quite reach the floor. The shadow beneath it shifted differently when you moved past. Lewis knocked once, then twice, as though he expected it to reply. It did. The unit rolled back on hidden casters. Dust sighed out like a held breath. Beyond, a corridor of little ambition, low ceiling, plaster flaking, and at the end, a door half consumed by the wall around it. No key, just rusted hinges and the subtle resentment of wood long ignored. It opened eventually. The room wasn't large, perhaps 10 feet square, airless but not oppressive, the kind of space designed to contain memory, not movement. Inside, a single mattress. Thin, folded blankets, none newer than a decade. A wooden crate filled with paperbacks, poetry mostly. Elizabeth Bishop. HD a copy of No Light for the Dreaming in poor condition, its cover loose at the spine. And the coat, not blue, dark green, almost black in this light. Heavier, practical. I ran my fingers along the hem. No label, but in the inner lining, stitched carefully in dark thread. She waits differently now. Lewis crouched by the books. He found a matchbox beside one of the candlesticks. Partially used. Lavender-scented wax. She'd been here. Not recently, but deliberately. He said it aloud, what we were both thinking. She staged it, the whole thing. A disappearance, but not in panic, in punctuation. I nodded. There was something almost structural about it. A symmetry, a locked room, a coat left behind, a tunnel leading not to escape, but to this, a space between intention and erasure. She'd read the college's myths too closely, knew the stories that lived in footnotes. I returned to the photograph, the one Madeline had given me. The unnamed woman beside Ven, the tilt of her head, just off-center, not shy, defensive. She died, supposedly, in 1999. Suicide, the official story. Found in a stairwell after a disciplinary hearing that never quite became public, but Isla had been reading between the stories. Unpeeling them, the woman hadn't died alone. The report mentioned an anonymous tip, the kind that sounds like concern but arrives too late. Isla had traced the report. I found it, buried in her notes, marked with a red tab. She'd underlined one line. The student was found in proximity to faculty accommodation. Vens by proximity. The locked room wasn't just a trick. It was a reference, a reconstruction. Isla had built it to echo that first death, to show how repetition becomes erasure. She hadn't vanished to escape. She'd vanished to accuse. Lewis asked the obvious question. If she planned to reveal it, where is she now? I didn't answer. The coat had been left behind, but the books hadn't been dusted. Someone had returned. Recently. There was no sign of struggle, no trace of fear, but the candle, one of them had been burned nearly to the base. Alone, a vigil perhaps, or a final edit. I noticed then the faintest mark on the wall, beneath the shelving, barely visible. Pencil or charcoal. A phrase, the architecture of forgetting, requires a hidden room. I ran my finger across the words. They smudged easily. I stood, suddenly tired. The room had given us what it could. Not Isla, but her intention, her staging. We left as quietly as we'd come. Lewis locked the outer door behind us. I glanced once more at the dark hallway. She'd come here to expose a silence, but someone, it seemed, still knew how to deepen it. It wasn't Ven. That was the first thing I admitted. Not aloud, not to Lewis. Certainly not to the file that would one day be closed and shelved among other cases. But to myself, and only when the light had softened enough not to scorn the admission. It was the man in the bursar's office. A name I hadn't remembered at first, though it had been offered to me plainly, tucked inside a photograph like a faded notation, not the caption, but the implied presence between subjects. Arthur Lemaine. He'd changed his surname shortly after his departure from Balliol. Re-entered the university system through clerical corridors. A quiet return. Not quite shame, not quite disguise. Something more pedestrian, the desire not to be asked. He had known the woman in the photograph, the one beside Ven, the one whose death had been mislabeled as resignation, then tragedy, then loss. He had loved her, something close enough to make her memory a kind of property. And when Isla began following the thread, when she asked after names that weren't listed, dates that didn't quite match, he'd noticed. He worked the systems, the back doors, saw what books she borrowed, what tunnels she searched, what files she requested. He followed eventually. Not out of menace, I think, but panic. The rest is inference. The confrontation happened in the tunnel, not the sealed room. There she had merely staged. But in the passage itself, the thin space between past and present, he stopped her. There may have been pleading. I like to think he didn't intend to hurt her, but some men, when faced with a truth they cannot erase, choose confinement instead. He bricked the exit. Not fully. Just enough. When we found her, 4 days later, she wasn't broken. A writer's retreat, North Yorkshire. No name on the register, but a poem submitted to a local newsletter under a pseudonym. Not a great poem, but hers. I recognized the rhythm. She had walked out once the plaster had crumbled enough to yield. She had known how long it would take. Had measured it, perhaps. The room had always been temporary. Lewis drove her back. She didn't speak much, and he didn't ask. She gave a statement. Calm, unhurried. Refused to press charges. Said it wasn't a crime, not really. Just a correction made too early. Ven resigned the next morning. No fanfare. Just an email to the faculty and a flight booked for Vienna. I imagined him in a suit one shade too expensive, staring out over the Danube, still not quite understanding the shape of the mirror Isla had held up. As for Lemaine, he'll remain in the system. Shuffled. Not punished, but not trusted either. Universities are good at that. Memory without admission, Footnotes without context, and the investigation concluded itself. Paperwork followed. Doors closed. That night, I returned to the Randolph. The lounge was mostly empty. A fire coughed in the grate, trying to warm the stone without conviction. I ordered a whiskey. No ice, no explanation. The crossword lay open on the table, half finished, the pen still beside it. I let my fingers hover, then filled in the last clue. Invisible refuge. 5. Haven. The ink dried quickly. I closed the paper and leaned back. The window was streaked with rain, fine as thread. It caught the light of passing cars, but gave nothing back. Oxford, as ever, contained more shadow than shape. "We do not vanish," I murmured. "We are merely misplaced." A pause. Then softly, "For no one but myself, for a time." I finished the drink and sat a while longer. No epiphany, no victory. Just the slow, familiar weight of resolution that neither solves nor soothes. The kind that settles behind the eyes like tired music. Some truths don't arrive with clarity. They arrive with silence, and a coat folded too neatly to be accidental. The end.